In the Victorian era, there was a huge divide, which means really big difference, between how the rich people were living and how the poor people were living. Rich people were leading lavish lifestyles, whereas the poor were struggling to do things like buy food. Although there were some helpful social reforms at the time, this didn't fix everything.
The differences in lifestyles between the rich and the poor were really obvious, and even more so in cities, because the poorer people were moving from the country to cities for work, and there was lots of people, so places became overcrowded, and a lot of people were living in poverty.
Employers did build houses for their workers, but they were crowded, unsanitary, and often very unsafe. Not like the housing that the rich people were living in.
As well as servants, like those who were cooking and cleaning in rooms like this, richer families would have nurses or governesses to look after their children. And when I say nurse, I don't mean like a medical one, I mean like a babysitter. They looked after the children and they educated them and they were with them all day and basically did what you would think a parent would do.
Mothers would stay at home to plan social events and parties, and sometimes they would teach their children things in the evenings. But when the father came home from work, he would go to his study not to be disturbed.
Children in richer families would probably only see their parents in the evenings for a few hours after their nannies had cleaned and dressed them properly. The children of the Victorian times were taught to be seen and not heard.
In those families, parents didn't really have much contact with their children, although the same could be said for poorer families because the parents would be out working and so would the children. Either way, at the time, children were expected to call their father and other men sir because manners were so important.
Most of the richer families would have servants that would do the cooking for them, so they didn't have to sweat away in the heat of the kitchen, and servants to do the cleaning for them. And most people would end up working for the same family for their whole life. I think this is a Hoover.
They would have a longer metal tube on it.
During the Industrial Revolution, many mines, mills and factories were built for the poor to work in. Children and adults would work in very dangerous conditions. They would work up to 12 hours a day, and the pay was so bad they could barely even afford to buy food.
At the start of the era, the majority of people couldn't read or write, but Queen Victoria knew the importance of education, and by the end of the era, it was compulsory for all children to go to school. They were a lot stricter than nowadays though, so you might not have had as naughty classmates. They didn't have electronics like computers or whiteboards, and children would write on little chalkboards as well. It would have been quite difficult learning to spell.
Life and housing was especially bad in big cities like London and Birmingham. There was a new type of house being built called back-to-backs, which were often in a square, so you'd have all the houses backing onto each other with a courtyard that they would share, and they would all share one toilet. There would often be more than one family living in a house, and by house we mean one room downstairs for eating and cooking and one room upstairs for sleeping. Sometimes there would be 10 people in one of these houses. And the worst part is there wasn't even any running water, so often disease could spread quickly through these places. The Factories Act of 1833 stated that children under the age of 9 could only work in silk factories, so perhaps less difficult work. It also stated that children between the ages of 9 and 12 could only work limited hours, no one under 18 could work at night, and they all had to have a lunch break. This still seems really difficult, but it actually did greatly improve things for children at the time.
At the start of the Victorian times, sewage and rubbish was just left in the street. It was dirty and disgusting. But in 1875, the Public Health Act put a stop to this. They made sure that there was a sewage system in place and there was a bin collection. So the sewage and rubbish wasn't just left in the street to spread diseases more quickly. And it also stopped a tax on soap. Can you imagine having to pay extra for soap? When the tax was got rid of, it meant that poorer people could actually afford it, so they could wash properly now.
Fashion was very different for the rich and for the poor. The poor would wear bonnets or hats to keep their hair out of their face when they were in factories, and also to keep lice out of their face. They would wear very simple clothes that could be mended and worn for a very long time, whereas the rich would wear more elaborate clothing and women would wear huge hoop skirts.
Poorer people would mostly just eat bread and vegetables because that's all they could afford. So they would have been relatively healthy if they had a decent amount of it and weren't struggling for the amount of food. Whereas richer people would eat huge feasts.
Queen Victoria used to eat multiple courses for her meals, and cooked breakfast became popular in the Victorian era.
Pubs were popular in the Victorian era because people could share stories with their friends and catch up after a hard day's work.